Okay, I've been talking a little bit about the Masons, and I'm going to talk in this video about the Masons and the banking industry. Now, I have two sources of information on which I will base this statement. The very first source of information comes from my mother. My mother is no longer with me on this earth, and she has entered into eternal glory. But when my mother was a young lady, prior to her marriage to my father, she worked for about 2 years in a major bank in a major city in the United States. My mother told me several times that all the bosses in that bank were Masons. Now, my mother knew this at that particular time, and that was many, many years ago. So on the basis of what my mother told me, I am telling you. Now, the second source of information is my own personal life. And I'd like to refer you to a video that I did about bank robberies and bank robbers, that most of them are fake. And I will retell the story. I banked at a local bank in the town which I was living in Virginia. In fact, it was not a national bank. It was so local, there were only 2 banks with that name in that town. One day I was driving by the bank and I noticed police cars. And I surmised correctly that there was supposedly a bank robbery. I stayed across the street and just observed. There was one police officer who had what I would term a Tommy gun, a semi-automatic type machine gun, and he was simply standing out in the open in the parking lot. Now, I began to reason from across the street. If there really was someone with a gun who was really desperate and would kill individuals, why would a police officer stand in the middle of the parking lot, out in the open, like he's directing traffic? He was not behind his vehicle. He was not behind a pillar or anything, just standing out in the open, holding this Tommy gun pointed up in the air. So then the story gets a little more complicated. Supposedly, the bank robber ran in and around the area where there were other stores, past a paint store. I went down to the paint store and talked to the man that was on duty at the time, and he said, oh yeah, he heard the commotion, and he opened his back door to see what was going on, and a police officer yelled and screamed at him, get back in there, close that door, close that door. And they published photos of the man, the so-called robber. Now here's the point. After a few days, the bank was reopened. And when the bank was reopened, the owner of the bank placed a photograph of himself, like an 8x10 in a frame, on a stand in the bank. That photograph had never been there in the 3 or 4 years that I went in and out of that bank. Now here's the most interesting thing about the photograph. Now I know this is Donald Trump, so the owner of the bank wasn't Donald Trump. But he was standing there with his hands folded in this fashion, pointing downward. Do you see that? That is some type of Masonic gesture. Don't ask me to decipher it. I don't know. It's like a triangle. It could be your 7-7, 2 sevens. This is a 7 here with your thumb in this way. That's a 7 there. Okay, so it's a 7-7. It's a triangle, but it's pointed down, so that could be something like as above, so below. Okay, that demonic motto, as above, meaning as in the second heavens where the powers and principalities are, so below on earth. In other words, we submit to the powers and principalities in the second heaven, and we want them down here in the first heaven. It could mean that, I don't know. I'm not definitive on this. I'm just telling you my experience now, that the owner of the bank put a portrait out of himself with his hands in this fashion. Now that portrait remained out on that stand for about 2 weeks and then disappeared. Now what was he doing? He was telling all of his Masonic buddies that the bank robbery was phony. And indeed, I looked at the photograph of the so-called robber, and I think if you could pull off some of the disguises, I think it really literally was the owner of the bank. So those are my 2 stories for you, to just simply let you know that banking is in the hands of the Masons. Yes, they do run it. And yes, most likely, the bank in your town or your community or your city where you bank, most likely the higher officials in that bank are Masons. Now, I'm not going to say that the clerks that wait on you are. All right? I think they're completely oblivious. Okay? But once you start talking about the managers of the banks, the owners of the banks, or the supervisor over several banks or whatever, now you're getting into the Masonic Brotherhood. Okay? And this can certainly tie into the idea that ultimately the devil wants what? A one world economy, a one world religion, and a one world government. So it'll be easy to secure it because the pawns and the puppets, the Masons, are heavily, I'll use the word, invested in the banking industry. Oh, and incidentally, another thing I can say is they're heavily involved in the banking industry because every bank is a scam. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, basically, there's nothing behind there in the vaults. A little bit of something, but nothing. If everybody were to come and withdraw their monies, they wouldn't be able to supply it because there's nothing there, basically. A little bit. So it's a scam. It's just credit. It's not lawful money. Well, anyhow, I've talked about that in other videos, and I've said enough. So this is the end of the video.